Hello and welcome. It's Friday. You made it through another week. Congratulations and welcome to the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Today, we're being visited by our friend Varla Ventura. It's been a while since she's been here. She's the author of Fairies, Pukas, and Changelings, Banshees, Werewolves, Vampires, and Other Creatures of the Night. Among the Mermaids, The Book of the Bizarre, and Beyond Bizarre. She's been with our show, I think, over the last 7 or 8 years as a pretty regular contributor. She's back. She has a new book coming out this June. It's called Varla Ventura's Paranormal Parlor, Ghosts, Seances, and Tales of True Hauntings. She's back with us. Varla, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I love being on your show. It's always so much fun.
It's good to have you back. Yeah, it's we love your style of writing, the different topics of books that you cover. You've always got something fresh to bring back to us. And this, when I saw it coming out, excited me. Now, for listeners that are interested, you can go to darknessradio.com. Click on our Killer Deals link, and you'll find the book right there so you can pre-order it right now and get your grubby little mitts on it. So as soon as it releases in June, it will be immediately shipped to you. And what a lot of you don't know is, like, if it's got a June 1st sell date, a lot of times when you put in that pre-order, Amazon pre-orders seem to go out a week or two before the book hits the shelves anywhere else. So that might even give you a jump on it. Yeah. It's kind of an
I have had
deal.
People get their book before I have received the first copy from my publisher.
That's what I've heard.
So I pre-order my own book on Amazon just to track what comes faster and to make sure I get it as quickly as possible, because there's nothing like, that first copy, just kind of like stick your nose in it and inhale. It's pretty...
I think I'm starting to know too much about you, Varla. Let me ask you,
familiar.
You've written on so many cool topics and weird and odd, parallels with the paranormal. Is there a specific topic that you really like the most? I mean, from werewolves to fairies to ghosts, and just the strange, bizarre things that are out there. Is there really one thing that, man, if I could just write about this and educate myself about this, that would be your go-to all the time?
Well, this book in particular is probably, I probably feel like that about each book. I love this book the most. And of course, I have a deep love for folklore and magical creatures, especially, fairies from Ireland and things of that nature. But this book, I think this book probably is the topic that I like the most, because it's a collection of ghost stories. So just, straight up like spooky stories, freaky stories that other people have told me that have happened to them, my own paranormal experiences. But one of the chapters that I really get into are kind of the talk of the subject of paranormal parlor, the idea of these games that are, paranormal in nature, things like the Ouija board and seances. And I have a particular passion for the sort of strange and hidden history of that. These incredible stories like the woman who channeled Mark Twain's Ghosts lost novel all through the Ouija board, and sort of everyone from the charlatans, the Fox sisters to, the Mrs. Piper, who could never be proved to be false when she went into all of her trances. So this kind of history also in terms of the way it relates to women's history and how women were able to use the psychic arts to sort of get above their station or get outside of their own parlors and kind of explore the world. So that is kind of a huge, I feel like that could just be a book in and of itself rather than just a chapter. And I definitely had to rein myself in, because every time, book research is like the internet. It's a rabbit warren. You turn one corner and then you start talking to somebody and they say, oh, but have you heard of this woman? And then, oh, did you hear of this couple? And you just kind of keep following all of these things. And by the time you hit publication, you've already got a list of 10 things you should have included. Try not to annoy your editor too much by adding things. So I think the general topic of the psychic arts and, Ouija board and seances is something I'm quite passionate about, along with just some good old fashioned ghost stories. And that's a never ending. It's really never ending, because you're always going to meet somebody who's had a paranormal experience that they want to share with you. And you're always going to meet somebody who's going to recommend this, fine old Scottish ghost tale. Or when I was working on this book, I had wonderful friends who would send me these books that, look what I found. Oh, it's Elliot O'Donnell's collection of ghosts. Oh, look at this. And they would just find these books in, thrift stores, and they'd send them to me, and it would just kind of work out that, oh, that's the exact chapter I'm on. So I had a lot of like great synchronicity where, my life and my passions crossed over into this book. So I really enjoyed writing it, and didn't feel as stressed out writing it as I did with some of the others.
Well, let me jump in, if you don't mind. One that fascinates me is this story of the woman that was able to, or made the claim that she was channeling the ghost of Mark Twain, and used a Ouija board for this, ended up writing the entire book and getting this information. Now, were there witnesses to this, that she was using a Ouija board to, garner all this information, or did she write this and then make the claim that it came from the Ouija board?
So there's a whole backstory to it. There were witnesses and
let's start from the beginning. All right, introduce us to who this woman was and a little bit of her background.
Okay, so the woman that we're speaking of, her name was Emily Grant Hutchings. She was born in 1869, and she died sometime in older age, when she was in her 80s. And she wrote this novel, published it in 1915. It was called Japheron, Japherron. And you won't find this book on any bookshelf. If you do, you simply must let me know that you saw a real copy of it. But essentially, she has this great story because there's a woman that listeners may be more familiar with who wrote under the name Patience Worth. And she wrote poems and poetry and some novels, and actually became quite around the same time, around the, turn of the 20th century. She became quite well known and quite successful, and actually was even deemed like poet laureate for a while in the United States. All of her material she claimed to have been channeling through an entity. So it wasn't her. It was this entity that was giving her all this information. Now, she and Emily Grant Hutchings were actually friends. So now you have a young woman who's a journalist and a writer at heart, who wants to sort of break out of her. I believe she lived in St. Louis. And she starts dabbling in the psychic arts and actually gets her friend involved in it. And this friend, Pearl Curran, she starts to have this visitation, and she starts channeling all this material. And then she actually finds great success with it. As she's getting that success, meanwhile, Emily is either concocting this incredible backstory or living this incredible backstory in which she walks into a seance, and the medium who is conducting the seance with her hands on the Ouija board turns to Emily and says, "You are the one." And this develops into an ongoing relationship in which this medium said that there was the ghost of a writer who had been trying to speak through her, but was not happy with anyone who was in the room until enter Emily. Emily comes in, she sits down, he identifies himself as Samuel Clemens and proceeds to dictate his novel From Beyond the Grave. And it gets even more amazing than that because it's a very long book. I would say it's probably at least 60 to 80,000 words scribed via the Ouija, maybe even longer. And I have to do a word count on it sometime because if you think about each little, yes and no and A and B and all of the letters on the Ouija board, it would take a very, very long time. So Emily, her husband, Mr. Hutchings, is as all he's known by, and the medium work together to kind of reposition this Ouija board so that it essentially is a psychic typewriter. They add punctuation, common punctuation, apostrophes, periods, exclamation points, question marks, so that they don't have to spell out apostrophe. They can just go to the apostrophe mark. And so sort of fashion this board. During this time, the ghost of Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, is dictating a story, but he will pause occasionally and make commentary about things he likes or doesn't like, or if somebody else is in the room that he doesn't like, or something that she's done, stop putting all those damn apostrophes in there and things like that. So when you're reading the novel Jap Perón, it starts out with this very grandiose introduction about the creation of Jap Perón. And there's all these quotes that sound very Twain-like. And in fact, when you are reading the book, there are certainly times, which it's not a particularly compelling novel, but what's intriguing about it is that there are times that you do, this sounds like something Mark Twain would have written. Of course, then you keep in mind that Mark Twain's voice was mimicked widely. And, he was sort of, somebody who was groundbreaking in his strong dialect, in his way that he delivered the adjectives and all of the things about him, the voice of Mark Twain. You could probably read a Mark Twain book and then try and duplicate it. So that's not necessarily a compelling argument that it's authentic. As I was...
But can I ask, isn't it kind of interesting though, right? That this person, if they're faking it, had to think about, it's one thing to sit there and type, as you and I know as authors. You type, the words come out, you put them there. But then to sit there with a Ouija board and spell everything, I can't even begin to imagine how tedious that would be, and then still keep the voice. Because when you and I are writing using a keyboard or a typewriter, you're doing it in your staccato or your canter or whatever your normal speaking style would be. But to sit there and write it ANDTHEBOY, right, and to come up with something that would sound and the end result would be Twain-like, that starts to really grab my attention, as maybe this isn't so easily dismissed. Because you've got that really broken way of writing. That had to be insanely hard.
And it took them, I believe, over 2 years to achieve this. And it was, 3 people working full time, because Emily wasn't necessarily, she had to work with the medium. She didn't claim to be a medium herself, but she claimed that the ghost would speak to her and through her. Now, anyone who has, written something or written a piece of music, written a poem, we all have these moments of absolute divine inspiration. You can even go back to Aleister Crowley and the Book of Law, in which he basically heard a voice when he was in an Egyptian pyramid in a temple, and transcribed the Book of Law sort of trance-like. And if you are to read it, and you read it sort of objectively like that, not trying to extract magic or rules from it, but you read it as a piece of prose, you will see this amazing feat of channeling something like that and not stopping. I mean, of course they had to stop and, go to bed at night and things like that. So the story continues, and she manages to write most of it. She actually finds a publisher for it, and it goes to press. And it goes to press with this lovely introduction. Well, the daughter of Samuel Clemens finds out, as does his publisher, who has the, royalty rights, that this this book claiming to be a Mark Twain book is coming out, and they pull it from the stands. So it is published, but a lawsuit is brought against the publisher who publishes it. So it's immediately pulled from the stands and, probably burned. Of course, a few copies survived because we have a facsimile on Gutenberg.org. You can look it up. There's a facsimile manuscript of the book is there. So it had a copyright page. It had a cover. It had, a picture of Mark Twain in it. It had her introduction. So when I started looking into sort of the backstory here, and there's far more to it. And this is when you asked that question at the beginning, could you just write on this topic forever? If you could dig into the right archives, if you could spend enough time digging, there's much more to this story. Because there are letters of correspondence between Twain and Emily Grant Hutchings, in which he is very dismissive to her. So then this idea comes forward that, she was just this, fangirl, basically, who wanted to mimic him. And so again, she's dismissed. So now you have, this kind of juxtaposition of a woman who could be faking it, but also is very talented. Now they're saying she's just been sort of dismissed, and so she's disgruntled, and that's why she's claiming this. So there are all these different arguments about it. There are letters between them. There's some evidence that they met. She lived in St. Louis, so, that's not far from where Twain, it's like Mark Twain country there. So there are all these kind of overlapping, really fascinating aspects to the story. But the end result is that this woman did write an entire novel. She claims it was channeled from the Ouija board. I mean, and as you said, I get tired, handwriting anymore. It's like, okay, even I can type very fast, but if I had to type my entire novel, even on an old typewriter, it would take me 3 times as long, and my fingers would be, bitten down to the quick, basically. So it's the other thing that comes into play here is the idea that essentially these 2 women, were expected to be contented St. Louis housewives. Their husbands were fairly well off, fairly upstanding members of society. And in order for them to sort of break out of what was their mold and what was kind of cast before them, I mean, imagine you did this all in a corset on top of it all, right? You're like bound up in this corset trying to sit up properly. So you basically, you're in this position where women could often use the psychic arts to gain some rights before they even had the right to vote. They could travel alone. They could make money. They could gain notoriety for something other than what their husband did for a living. And so it was, and especially for sort of like middle class women and middle to upper class women who had the leisure time to attend seances and not necessarily have to do hard labor. It became an outlet. And so you see that throughout the spiritualist movement, which was a movement that started in the late sort of the Victorian era and moved up through the Edwardian era, into the 1920s. And it was essentially the belief that you can communicate with the dead, and you can communicate, via certain tools and mediums and certain people to get contact from the afterlife, and then get, advice and poems and things like that.
How interesting, though, right? To write an entire book in this voice of one of our most beloved authors and do this kind of weird connection. And the question is always remains, right? What if?
The question always remains, what if?
Right.
Whether it was a publicity stunt or it was the most brilliant, semi-brilliant publicity stunt, because
right.
It really didn't gain her anything until after the fact. And quite honestly, I had never heard of this until probably about 15 years ago when I was doing a research project for my book publisher, to look through public domain works. And I think I was looking specifically for old books that or old instances, accounts of seances and the use of the Ouija board. And this came up in a search, and I mean, my jaw hit the floor, because I thought, wait, what does it say? What, a novel written in Ouija? And I had to read that intro 3-4 times to start really grasping what was happening. And I included I didn't include the entire novel in my latest book, but I did include a good portion of her introduction, and I also kind of, take it apart and get into it a little bit more to put it a bit more in historical context and what we know and what we don't really know. But nonetheless, even as a writer today, if you were put to task to write something in the voice of Mark Twain, to write an entire novel and convince enough people that it got published. Somebody believed her enough to give her probably a small advance and put the expense of putting the book to press in 1917. That's no small feat in and of itself.
No doubt. That is really remarkable. Very cool. So that's one. Now, when you look back at this, though, and, as a researcher and an author yourself, and I know it's hard sometimes, we want to remain objective about this stuff. Does this story intrigue you enough? I mean, obviously you include it in the book, but does it intrigue you to the sense that you think there's something more to this than just somebody cashing in or trying to? Do you believe that there was some kind of ghostly help?
It's just such a layered situation. I do believe she was hearing a voice, and I do believe that she transcribed a good portion of this via the Ouija, if not every single word. I do believe that, based on my understanding of typewriters and Ouija boards and her understanding of grammar. I mean, just in and of itself, that it's a very Twain-like thing to do, to make somebody kind of guess and laugh and re-examine an aspect of society. So I absolutely think that at the baseline, there's the possibility that's all completely true, and it all totally happened the way she said it happened. Of course, I think that is possible. I also think it's not a black or white issue. Did she or didn't she? And it just brings up all of these questions about what was her life like? What was life for a woman of her standing? As a writer, what would have happened to me if I had been, trying to write and survive in San Francisco in 1915? How would I have made ends meet? What if I didn't marry up? All those kind of things that it's just becomes, it's like this, tangled ball of yarn that you're constantly sort of trying to peel apart. But there's so much to it. But I absolutely, I have had moments where I have gone into trance and written things that I don't remember writing. So who's to say that something wasn't speaking through me? And so many writers, we have thousands of pieces of art and works of literature and volumes of poetry all dedicated to the muse. I mean, we all have something that has to spark that creativity. So it is it's a trance-like state. In fact, I read something really interesting before I started writing this book about the creative process, and that it actually takes your brain something like 45 minutes to actually finally get into that creative rhythm. For example, if you were writing or painting or sketching something out, it would take you that long just to get to the point where you're sort of suspending the rest of the world around you, and you eventually get lost in the story that you're writing or in the thing that you're creating.
And that's right, isn't it? Isn't it, the hardest thing is sitting down with that computer or with that typewriter, looking at that first blank sheet, and then you start, that's why I always try to have some ideas in my head before I even sit down, like just a couple of basic points. But it is once that spigot has been turned on, man, it starts pouring out of you.
And you just have to, I think the biggest challenge that I face are the distractions that come up, just in daily life. You've got to shove your phone into the closet. You've got to lock your doors. I am not the kind of person that can go and write in a coffee shop or something like that. Absolutely not.
Maybe you should give it a try. It worked good for J.K. Rowling.
Right? I mean, I can I can handwrite, I can write in a journal, but I can't, just sit, I just can't really, I need a lot of, it's not even quiet. I do just need some quiet
time, right?
I need focus time, and I need to get past that 20-minute mark, because I'm constantly thinking of something else some other idea that I want to write down. So just to stay with a story or a manuscript or a linear thought, I got to get at least 20 minutes in before, I can come up even for a sip of wine.
Fair enough. Varla, the idea that people are able to communicate, and for anybody that's still on the fence post about, I don't know that I really believe in channeling, I don't know that I believe in automatic writing, it is something that artists, authors, musicians have all talked about, and they're not even talking about it in the metaphysical woo-woo way you and I are talking about it, right? They just open up, and suddenly they become this conduit for information. Do you think there's a danger? People talk about the danger of the Ouija board. Obviously, this woman got great information and wrote an entire book utilizing the Ouija board, and there are other people that have done the same thing. But when it comes to automatic writing and you're allowing something into you to work through you, do you believe that does leave a fracture in your soul or your psyche that could lead to an attachment or possibly even something darker?
No, I actually do not believe that.
Well, thanks for joining us, Varla. That's it for tonight. No, I'm just kidding.
I do believe that things get attached, and I do believe that there are things that you may do or may experience that can bring those. I don't think the creative process and that sort of trance or automatic writing, or even the Ouija board necessarily is to blame in that kind of situation. I do think it leaves you open to thoughts, and but I think it comes down to the individual so much. And I know that a lot of people feel very trepidatious about the Ouija board, and there are a lot of scary stories, and the Ouija board does weird things, and I've had some weird experiences myself. So I completely understand that. But whether something can actually attach itself to you when you're working on this kind of automatic writing, if it does, you probably need to keep writing. For example, if you were to channel something she probably had to channel this novel to completion. If she hadn't, perhaps it would have lingered on. Now, I'm speaking a little more about the creative process and that aspect of sort of channeling and losing yourself in that process and letting, I mean, how many musicians do you know who say the guitar writes the songs? They don't even write the song themselves. And, then you have the Devil and Daniel Johnson. Like, did he meet something at the crossroads that gave him those, Robert Johnson's great powers to create these amazing songs? There's all this kind of lore around that. And I'm certainly not going to sit here and say that didn't happen or that can't happen, because I find that just the idea that can happen fuels my creativity.
Well, let me just tell you this. Do you remember the movie Crossroads starring Ralph Macchio?
Yeah. Oh. Right.
Which is based on that whole storyline.
Right.
Tell me that guy hasn't struck a deal with the devil. He's doing a new series for YouTube. Have you seen Cobra Kai, the commercials for that?
No.
They're doing a follow-up to the Karate Kid. It's now being told from the story of Johnny, the kid that he beat in the first Karate Kid movie. But Ralph Macchio is back. He doesn't look any older. It's really creepy. He puts on the
Dick Clark kind of situation.
Right. Yeah, he puts on the old karate outfit and the headband. It doesn't look any different than the last time he donned the outfit 35 years ago. So, see, there is something to making a deal with the devil. I believe that.
There
Ralph
is,
Macchio
and I think we should all, it's just something, just let him lay his cards on the table and take it into consideration. Don't rule it out immediately out of fear. You might be able to outsmart him. I mean,
I'm not going to take that chance.
Instances in folklore of, little old ladies and clever young men just completely outsmarting the devil by, chasing him up into a tree or
playing fiddle with him. I know that story.
You know how that ends.
All right. So give me another one of your favorite stories from the book as you're doing this. And we're talking about the channeling of Mark Twain's ghosts. What other story really struck you that you thought, I need more information on this?
Okay. So, I had, just to switch gears a little bit, I had some really wonderful contributors who told me stories about things that had happened to them. And for whatever reason, there became a theme. So I reached out to a few people, Jeff Ballinger. I asked him, would you be willing to share a story, like a ghost encounter? I know you've been researching the paranormal for all of these years.
I guess my email from you must have gotten lost in the digital mailbox.
I totally tried to book you.
Oh, you are such a fibber, Varla Ventura.
I totally tried to book you, actually. Okay. I did.
Like your story. I'll be in the next one. I'll do the next one.
Maybe we can shove you into this one. We can do it, Dave.
Pardon me? I don't need to be shoved in. Just shoehorn me.
Oh, that can be arranged. There could be time. Yeah. So anyway, I found this theme where when I asked people, can you tell me about a paranormal experience? And it was people that were in the field that I thought, they've had dozens. How are they ever going to choose? And over, I was given their very first, the experience that turned them. And I discovered that even for myself, you can spend all of these years and all of this time and you can, travel the world seeking the paranormal, interviewing people about the paranormal and their experiences. But it changes when you have that experience yourself. And so that sort of brings me to one of my favorite characters, this man named Elliot O'Donnell, who was an Irish writer and a ghost hunter. And during the time, I excerpted from him in both my fairies, pukas, and changelings books, as well as the Banshee section of my Banshee Werewolf Vampire book, because he was this amazing man who hunted ghosts, but not for the reasons that he gathered folklore, not for the reasons that so many others gathered. To make a historical record and to keep track of things and to preserve the old ways. Isn't that nice? He did it because he was haunted. And he always his writing stands out to me in that way because he had had experiences as a young child. And so instead of coming at everything with a little bit of ethnocentricity or, skepticism, he always came at it with the possibility that it could be real. And so I just that's sort of just a theme throughout the book of that idea of I think it's pretty obvious where my heart lies. I mean, I'm a supernaturalist at heart. I'm not exactly putting out a book saying none of this stuff could possibly exist. But I think that even I became more and more convinced as I got deeper and deeper into stories that people told me. And of course, you've had this experience over the years yourself, because people open up to you and they tell you the weirdest shit of all time, right? And it's like late at night and they're just going to tell you the weirdest thing that ever happened to them. So I think for me, that became a bigger part of the book than I expected it to be. Not just other people's stories like old-fashioned ghost stories, but these sort of firsthand accounts of the things, not just that, freaked them out or made it kind of spooky, but it was really like the things that it was the tipping point for so many of these people who then went on to dedicate their life or had already been dedicating their life to, finding out more about the paranormal and the supernatural. So that that became another topic that I couldn't quite ever get all of it in, because there's just so much to it. And every time you hear a story, then you can share a story, and then somebody shares a story back with you. And so there's just all of these levels of, understanding with, there's the writer's understanding, which is trying to just tell a great story. There's the experiencer's understanding, which is the person who actually had the experience. There's the believer who is dedicating, perhaps not every moment of their waking life, but a good portion of their life and their life's work to promoting and trying to understand more about the paranormal, the supernatural, or life after death. And, and then of course you have just some of those little things in there that are just left to make you wonder or, frankly, to scare you. There's nothing like a good haunted institution story to really kind of rile your feathers and make you feel afraid in the dead of night. Haunted hospital.
I don't know what you're talking about, Varla. But that brings us to the point in the show we need to take a break, because it's time for Theater of the Mind. From the Darchives, a horrifying true story from Ravi. Mom's a real cut-up on this week's Theater of the Mind. What I'm about to share with everyone is the absolute truth. It's one of the most terrifying and saddest moments in my life, and I could never forget it, even if I wanted to. It all started when I was around 12. We lived in a small apartment building a few yards from a graveyard. I remember every single time my parents drove us by that graveyard, I would get this eerie feeling that eyes were on us, always watching us. One morning, I was probably the first person to get out of bed while everyone else was still fast asleep. I walked down the hallway that led to the bathroom to wash up for school, when all of a sudden, before my very eyes, a black, misty shadow in the shape of a person came out of the wall and moved at a walking pace into my parents' room. I was freaked out. I ran back to my room, which I had shared with my younger sister at the time. She was still asleep, so I woke her up by shaking her. She got very angry. She just wasn't a morning person, and when I told her what had happened, she immediately knew I was telling the truth, as she saw how pale I was in horror. That morning, we both went to the bathroom together, and after that, I never saw the shadow again. But that wasn't the last experience that we had in that apartment. A few days had passed, and on one particular evening, me and my sister and my mom were home while Dad was at the work, tending to our video shop that we owned back then, when VHS was still around. He'd usually be accompanied by Mom, working till late in the evening, and me and my sister would be alone at home, but this night Mom wasn't feeling so well, so Dad went by himself. It was getting late, so me and my sister went to bed. As I started to drift asleep, Mom came in our room. But the strange thing was, she just stood there, in near complete darkness, with a bit of light coming through our window from the streetlight outside. My first thoughts were she was just coming in to check on us and tuck us in. She started walking over to my sister, who saw Mom too. What happened next, I'll never forget. She had a kitchen knife in her hand. I was completely paralyzed. As I'm sharing this story, my entire body is trembling from remembering the events from that night. "Mom!" I yelled. "What are you doing?" I asked frantically as tears filled my eyes. She totally ignored me. The whole room was so cold. The atmosphere changed, and the person I called Mom that I'd known my entire life had a presence like something I'd never felt before. It felt like dread. She leaned over my sister, her eyes wide, opened, and a grin just as Jack Nicholson had in the movie The Shining. My sister was freaking out, crying and asking what was wrong. Mom just kept grinning and asked,
"Is it okay if I cut up your pretty little face?"
I begged Mom to stop, but she just ignored us. Then she came to me, leaned over with the same twisted face, and told me to
smile,
and asked,
"Is it okay if I cut up your face as well?"
I was frozen with fear, thinking that any moment with a knife in her hand, I was going to die. The way she spoke to us was as if she was a completely different person. My first thoughts right away were, she's possessed. I thought for sure that me and my sister were about to be killed. This lasted around 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I looked my mom in the eyes and told her I loved her and told her to stop tormenting us. After a while, she went back to her bedroom and fell asleep. I quickly got out of bed and quietly tiptoed to our house phone, which was in the living room. I dialed the phone, and my dad answered. I told him what had happened. Moments later, he arrived, comforting me and my sister. "Everything will be fine," he assured us. He then went into the bedroom where Mom was and couldn't do much because she was already asleep by then. That night, we barely slept a wink, but we finally dozed off from exhaustion. The next morning, with the events from the night before still fresh in our minds, my sister and I were afraid to see our mom. Dad had already left for work, and we needed a ride to our bus stop for school, which wasn't close by. What happened at home that morning, I can't remember very well, but what I do recall was that ride in the car with Mom. She was the very same person as she had been that last night, with her eyes wide open and a smile that could rival the Grinch. She didn't say a word as she drove me to my bus stop, but what really terrified me the most was that she drove the entire way staring at me, not the road. We hit a little curve, but that was about it. Arriving at the bus stop, I was relieved but worried at the same time about my mom's well-being when she left and what was going to happen with my sister, who was still at home, alone. Fast forward, after school, I would go to my grandparents', which was near my school, and stay there until my dad picked us up. When my sister arrived at our grandparents' from her school, I asked her what happened that morning. She told me the same thing happened to her, but a miracle, no accident. We told our grandparents about Mom, but they thought nothing much about it. Later, Dad came, and we told him about what had happened that morning. He told us nothing to worry about and said he'll handle it. We got home, and Mom was in her bedroom resting. When she woke up, it seemed like she was back to normal, as if nothing had happened. We told her about the things she did, but she said she couldn't remember anything, as if none of it ever took place. Around 3 years had passed, and we moved to a couple other rented homes until my parents saved up enough money and bought our very first house. It was a beautiful house, but something just didn't feel right. I thought to myself it was just my imagination, so I shrugged it off, considering it was due to my fascination with the paranormal. Back then, the program Sightings was on television, and I remember watching it alone in my room. Months passed by, and I got home from school one day. When I arrived, there were a bunch of cars that were parked in front of our house. At first, I didn't think very much about it, probably my parents were throwing a small dinner party. When I got in, I could hear my mom having a conversation with her guests in the living room. As I walked in the living room, the atmosphere was strange. Something wasn't right. Mom was sitting on the couch while her guests, family members, like my grandparents, aunts, and uncles, were sitting on the floor around my mom. Dad was sobbing sitting next to her. Where were all my cousins? None of them were there, which I thought was also strange because I was looking forward to seeing them. I asked them what was going on. Everyone looked concerned and said, nothing. All of a sudden, Mom yells out,
"We won the lottery!"
I freaked out, overwhelmed with joy. I asked her again, did we really win the lottery?
"We sure did,"
she replied. I thought to myself, if we won the lottery, how come everyone around here is so quiet? Not thinking much about it, I went to my room and had thoughts in my head, thinking about all the stuff we could buy with the money that we had won. Then my dad walked in the room and closed the door behind him. Tears were welling in his eyes and began streaming down his cheek, and I knew immediately something was really wrong. He told me Mom isn't herself. As soon as those words came out of his mouth, my thoughts went back to that dreadful event 3 years ago. My body started to tremble uncontrollably. Tears began to fill my eyes. I was at a loss for words. That evening, everyone accompanied my mom to the hospital where she stayed for a few days. The last time we saw her, she was bleeding this pinkish goo through her mouth and nose while she was wearing an oxygen mask. As I was crying my eyes out and looking into her eyes, she also had tears, but couldn't speak. But the look in her eyes, I could never forget it. It was like she wanted to say she was sorry for leaving us so soon. I told her I loved her, and we went out to a waiting room. I remember having a Bible with me, which I had brought along that evening, and prayed there begging to God to help. It got late, and my dad drove me and my sister to my grandparents', where we would spend the night while my dad returned to the hospital. My little cousin, who at the time was also staying over, wanted to play some Nintendo, so I joined him thinking it would help get my mind off the situation. While playing the game Bubble Bobble, my grandparents receive a phone call. It was Dad. I could hear him crying through the phone, telling us that Mom was gone. I sat there thinking, this isn't happening. It felt as though the world had stopped turning. I couldn't remember what my feelings were back then, or if I got any sleep that night, but I do remember that morning, the night after my mom had passed, everything through my eyes was gray, devoid of any color at all. It felt so unreal, having lost the most important person in my life. After her funeral, we had all our close family members sleep over at the house. It was so quiet and cold that night. I cried myself to sleep. In the early hours of the morning, I felt something had pushed down on the edge of my bed, as if someone sat there. Then a scent emanated from that spot. While I sat there, I felt a presence which I knew all my life. It was Mom. She came to say her goodbyes. I told her how much I missed her and loved her. Then I suddenly realized I had to share this experience with everyone in the house. So I ran out of the room and woke all my cousins up. They came rushing in my room and all saw the edge of my bed pressed down, and they were in awe. That moment gave me a bit of closure. Even after death, your loved ones are always with you.
Beyond the darkness.
We're back. This is the best in paranormal talk radio. I hope you enjoyed today's Theater of the Mind. Varla Ventura, our guest tonight. Her new book, Varla Ventura's Paranormal Parlor, Ghosts, Seances, and Tales of True Hauntings. The book will be available in June. We've got it up for you to pre-order right now. Go to darknessradio.com. Click on the Killer Deals link, and you'll find this book and all the great books that we feature on this show. You can order them right from that site, and every time you place an order, a small percentage of your sales goes into our pockets. That's how we help line the show and keep it going. It does not affect the seller. It does not affect anyone else. It's not adding on to your current order. It is for the exact same price you would normally do it. It's just an affiliate program that we have in place for our great audience. So check it out, and once you've gone in through our Killer Deals link, anything you order or look up while you're online, even if it's not part of our shop, a small percentage of each sale goes to help us out. And again, that helps keep down our overhead and expenditures. So anything you need to buy through Amazon.com, go to darknessradio.com and click on our Killer Deals link and use that link for all of your future purchases. It's just a great way to help out your buddies Dave and Tim on Beyond the Darkness. All right, Varla. We're back. This book is a showcase of chilling collection of startling ghost stories as told to you by all of these great contributors. Their legendary ghosts, haunted locations, and an overview of the Paranormal Parlor games that rose to popularity in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those parlor games, and then I want to hear some of the creepy, ghosty stories, if you don't mind sharing a couple with us here. But let's talk about the popularity of these parlor meetings and seances and weird games. Growing up, I did the Ouija board. We've talked about it on air. At parties, we did the light as a board, stiff as a feather. Did that go back? I mean, are there versions of that game that go back to the turn of the century and the parlor game stuff as well?
Looking into the mirror and chanting Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary.
Yeah, but you know what? I never get a Bloody Mary, and I'm dying for one.
Right? I mean, come on. We're grown-ups now. That's
Exactly.
how it's supposed to work.
Exactly.
I mean, I think there are variations on those kind of like classic parlor games, but what really started happening, so people have been doing these kind of oracles and communication with the dead and automatic writing and, channeling. Of course, that's been happening since time immemorial. I mean, we have tons of evidence of, the oracle at Delphi and all of these kind of ways that people connected with the gods and the goddesses and the afterlife and, the other side. But what really started happening during the sort of late Victorian era was this rise of the spiritualist movement, which was basically the idea that the dead could speak directly back to us through means of rapping on wood or moving a planchet around a Ouija board or speaking through a psychic. And it became so commonplace and so it kind of started in the upper echelons. I mean, even Mary Todd Lincoln had seances. So it became commonplace in that, not to say that every household did it, but it didn't have a sort of stigma to it that you might think. I mean, we're talking about an era in which people, did incredible woven paintings of their loved ones out of the hair of the deceased. So, and had wakes with, open caskets sitting in their parlor for long periods of time. So it was out of that sort of more morbid times came this idea that you could communicate with the afterlife. And you have wonderful examples of places like Lilydale in New York, which is still a center for sort of psychic convention, and they have regular seances, and people go there for spiritualist kind of enlightenment. You have communities that were formed where everybody was a believer. So I won't go so far as to say it was a cult, because it was really more of a movement, and not even necessarily a religious movement, because many of the people who were spiritualists also believed in other were practicing Christians or Catholics, or, you know, they had other belief systems. They also believed this made sense to them, that not everybody lingered around, but that there were certain people who lingered around, and certain ghosts and certain people who were sensitive to it. But what I love about this movement was that it was actually, it was born in a time when being open-minded was sort of starting to become a new and widely spread idea. And so you actually have a ton of crossover between the women's movement, feminism, and abolitionists, and people who believe that slaves should be freed, and people who are involved in the Underground Railroad who were hosting psychic salons. Because if you are open-minded and you believe that all people, you know, should have these rights, that kind of lends itself to the idea that you may be open-minded to other things. So it's a very interesting time period in our history that you also have like hilarious, well, I shouldn't say hilarious, but I find the Fox sisters to be this kind of hilarious extreme example, because essentially there were these three sisters, two of whom received messages and one of whom was essentially the stage manager. And they used the rapping method where you would hear, you know, "Are you alive?" Rap, rap. You know, you'd hear this knocking and that would be the answer. And that was how the dead would come back. This is all in the late, or the probably, yeah, like the late 1800s, for the 1870s to the 1880s, when they're really kind of 1890s, even, when they're really kind of traveling throughout the United States and Europe. They are this basically traveling show of these women who claim to be able to not necessarily answer your specific questions, but they're going to be able to channel something. As time went on, now they were quite a detriment to the spiritualist movement, because basically, at one point, the sisters got in a fight. Two of them were terrible alcoholics, and one of the sisters outed the other sisters as saying, basically, we faked the whole thing. Someone was under the table lifting it. Someone was behind the cupboard hitting the floor, so it sounded like the wrappings. And our cousin was the one in the audience who was asking the questions. And they totally were outed as charlatans. And then they couldn't take it back once they had done that. So they sort of betrayed each other in that process and died as, one of the stage manager married and went on to have a fairly normal life. But the two sisters, Kate and Margaret, who were the ones who were putting on the whole show and said that they were psychics, they basically died pauper alcoholics. And what it did is actually was sort of a detriment to the entire spiritualist movement, which really ended technically in the 1920s. But at this point in the late 1800s, almost to the turn of the century, you still had people who were channeling and doing things, but now there was a lot more skepticism and, you know, more scathing reviews of things. But it was, they made a fortune. They made a fortune that was squandered, basically, and they all died penniless. So, they're kind of a classic example of the opposite end of the spiritualist movement, of these women who took full advantage and were proved to be charlatans. But at the same time, you know, they were these incredible, they were able to convince probably millions of people that they were channeling something from the other side right in front of their very eyes. And what it does is it shows you how badly people wanted to believe that this was possible. Were willing to pay.
Part of the story was that, you know, maybe the possibility was that they really were at the beginning, but you get this pressure to continue to, you know, deliver. And sometimes they don't show up, but you've been paid for it. So then do you really, Is that when they start getting proficient at faking it as well? I'm there's so many of these stories like Enfield Poltergeist that was like that, where the activity actually took place, but she felt so much pressure having news cameras and people visiting that she felt like she had to make things happen so that, people would believe her. And, there's a strange dichotomy, right? In order to have people believe that something real is happening, you have to fake and kick something over to get their attention.
Yes, absolutely. And that is that's a huge dichotomy, because you have that so much even today. Every good, convincing ghost story starts out with, now, I'm not really a believer, but ... this happened to me. And now you're immediately like, oh, okay, well, they were convinced. And I think you find that a lot. And I think that it could be a combination of those things. I do think that there was some authentic ability, and that some people don't believe in psychics. They're probably not listening to this show right now.
What? No, it's funny. We have people that believe in fairies, Bigfoot, chupacabra, winged unicorns, but they won't believe in psychics. So,
or they don't believe psychics, right? Because there is this idea that psychics are supposed to be able to tell us all the truth all the time, and they have all the answers. And how many psychics would be on stage and just not give you an answer? They are going to just come up with whatever, comes to mind. So they become good at, reading cues and reading people. But I do think there was all this pressure, like, we've got millions of people following you. And there's this very, lovely crossover between the idea of mentalism and magic, like magic tricks and parlor tricks, and something more on the psychic end of things. Psychics don't look at like magicians that can, suspend themselves underwater and get themselves out of a lock. They don't necessarily say, oh, that's a psychic power. That's just this kind of cunning ability. But there's a sort of like cunning and quickness to all of it. Just to go full circle here, though, if we bring it back to the idea of fairies and fairy magic, they are called the cunning folk. They are called it's sort of they're quicker than you. They can pull one over on you. And it's not the idea that you're a fool or you're an idiot. It's that there are things that can happen right before your very eyes that you will not be able to explain. It might be a magician. It could be a fairy trick. But there are these ways of doing things. And yeah, you could take the scientific approach and you could dissect it. You can take the, the sort of occult or spiritualist approach and believe that it is much simpler than that it is an entity that is actually channeling, that it is a ghost speaking from beyond. But they all have this sort of that idea of the glamour or the trickery that is at the root of all magic, without which we would have, what would we have? We would not have literature. We would not have art. We probably wouldn't even have alcohol. So that idea of like trickery and cunning and charlatanism, at some point it took a turn for the worse, and it became this very negative thing. But there's a sort of sideshow element to the Fox sisters and to what they were doing that, is right up there with P.T. Barnum. In the end, it's like P.T. Barnum made this weird thing and said it was a mermaid, and people paid tons of money to go in the tent and look.
Yeah, we all have that interest, right, in the freak show.
Right?
In
they might have been
something.
disappointed when they came out the other end, but they still put their money in the basket on the way in, and there were no free refunds.
That's right.
So he was also an excellent businessman, and so I think that the sister who didn't do the actual channeling, who was the business manager, had a business mind. And so that's, there's pressure in that. There's pressure to perform. And, you wouldn't be very popular if you just stood up on stage and all of these people had paid their money and you said, I'm not feeling anything tonight. Sorry, folks.
Sorry, just not feeling
You're
it.
just going to put on a crappy show. You're not going to go up on stage and say, oh, my throat hurts. You're going to guzzle some honey and belt out the tunes and do your best. And otherwise people are, pelting you with tomatoes. So
what's some of your stories? Give me a couple of those now.
So one of the stories that I included in the book, and it's the first time that it's ever been in print, is a story from a very good friend of mine. And I immediately started referring to this story as the thing that moans in the woods. And he said, oh, okay, I call it the thing that moans on Indian Springs, which is the name of the road that he lives on. This is in Northern California. I won't give you his address because I don't want you to show up and ask him to demonstrate for you what happened. But I will just the setting for you. The first time I heard this story, my friend had purchased about 5 acres of fairly undeveloped land. It was next door to the property that he grew up on, his grandparents' property. So it was land that he had played on and roamed around all of his childhood. He was essentially raised by his grandparents, and he lived there for many, many years, and eventually was able to purchase kind of this section that abutted the grandparents' property. So he's quite familiar with the land and the noises and the things you hear that go bump in the night. And he's also an archaeologist by trade. So he's got a scientific mind. So he will apply the scientific method to most things that come up. But like my beloved Elliot O'Donnell, this friend of mine also had some very powerful and very freaky paranormal experiences as a kid, and a couple I could not get him to tell me for the book. He's told them to me, and they're scary enough, but they're scary enough sometimes he doesn't even want to retell them. Like, black scribble outline people that followed him around when he was a child and things like that. Shadow people. Anyway, so picture it. It's a bonfire. It's late at night. The stars are out. It's, there's no lights. There's no street lights. I mean, we're in the country. There's a dim light from sort of, the cabin beyond. The house that he's building is under construction, so nobody's living in it yet. And he's telling me the story. And the story is that the little house, which is called Casa Refugio, where I'm going to have to sleep that night, keep in mind, because they've set up, he and his then girlfriend, now wife, have set up their own sort of refuge in sort of the beginnings of the house. And so now I'm in the little guest cottage. Prior to the house beginning construction, he had been on the land one night in this little kind of casa, which is essentially like a shed that, was insulated and was near the wellhead. And it was a place that you could put a bed in, and you could be in out of the elements at night, and then you could get up in the morning and work on the property. So not glamorous, but very functional. And again, I have to sleep in this place tonight. So he tells me the story that, a few months prior, before they broke ground on the house, he was in the casa one night and, had been working on the property all day. He was there by himself. His girlfriend was at her house, and they hadn't yet moved to the property permanently. And he had been, working all day and clearing brush. And so he's finally tired. So he goes into his little hobbit hole there and is just settling down. It's just going to, go to sleep. And as he goes to settle down, he hears a moan that is unlike anything that he has heard before or since. He sort of described it as being this, almost as if somebody were putting down all their fingers on a synthesizer, and yet not really a melodic note at all, but really a sort of low moan that seemed to actually rattle the air itself. And he's thinking, okay, there must be some cattle down in the valley, and I'm hearing something reverberate. And so he's just sort of expecting it to thinking, what is that? But he's also thinking, oh, this will pass. So as he's kind of thinking that, he notices that the sound is not passing at all, but rather it is getting closer. And it seems to be coming up from the valley below and sort of climbing up the little mountaintop that he's on. The sound seems to be getting closer and closer. And so he sort of, very bravely steps out. I mean, this is his childhood home, so he steps out and he kind of looks around and he doesn't see anything and he doesn't hear anything. It sort of stops somewhat abruptly and he's looking around. He's thinking, is there an animal that's dying and somehow running at the speed of light up this mountain? He's using all of the scientific method to understand what is happening. And just as he steps back into the casa and goes to close the door, he hears the sound again, only this time it's so close, it's essentially right outside the walls. And now the walls are rattling. The things on the windows still are shaking as if there's an earthquake, and the sound is surrounding him. Now, he does not open the door at that point. He's just thinking, what could this possibly be? Like, and this is all happening, over a period of just a few minutes or a few seconds where the everything is shaking. So he goes and then it just stops. It stops and there's no echo. There's no reverberance. There's no lingering. It's just gone. So some time passes and he eventually, this is a very brave and very, brawny man. So it's not as if he's just hunkered down. He's thinking, what is happening? Still trying to be a bit logical about it. And he opens the door and he doesn't sense anything. He doesn't feel anything. He had, his hair was standing up on the back of his neck when he's hearing the sound, but he doesn't notice anything. So he kind of just doesn't quite know what to say. And eventually he just goes to sleep, and the next day, it's one of those things. I've noticed this myself when I've had anything that's sort of supernatural or paranormal encounter. In the moment, you spend so much time trying to rationalize and understand what's happening. You don't necessarily get that scared until you start thinking about it later. So he's thinking, I think he was a little scared in the moment, but he's thinking about it. And I'm scared he's telling me this story because I have to go sleep in that little refugio all by myself in the same woods where this crazy moaning thing seemed to clamor up and around. And I'm thinking, is this like a Wendigo? Like, what is this? It sounds banshee-like. It's just terrifying. So, you fast forward to the next day, and he's back up on the property, or I think the next day he goes to his girlfriend's house. They stay the night there, and he comes back to the property the following day, and he's doing some work again, clearing brush or whatnot, and he sees his neighbor walking up. So his neighbor and his neighbor's son are walking up, and the neighbor's son says, just kind of saying hi, or, oh, you're making good progress on the land. And he sort of, my friend sort of says, yeah, I heard this really weird thing the other night. And the kid just looks at him and he gets kind of like stricken and he says, you should go talk to my dad. So he goes down the hill, next house down, and he takes a little walk down there and he says to his, neighbor, I heard some really strange noises. I've lived here my whole life. I've never heard anything quite like that. And his neighbor tells him that his dog went completely crazy. It was the same night or the next, it was the early morning of that same time frame. And the dog went crazy and he heard some sort of crazy loud reverberating moaning sound followed by a splash into his pond and then silence. And to this day, we don't know what caused that, what created that. There are a few legends. It's Maidu territory. There are a few Maidu legends that speak of something kind of Bigfoot-like. There are a handful of logical explanations that you could try and come up with. But I can tell you that night I did not sleep well in that little casa because I was sure that whatever it was going to, creep up silently and then scream in my ears. And he actually first told me this story when I was working on the Banshee book. It was that long ago that it happened. And I'd never gotten him to let me retell it into print form until this book. But that is one of the more terrifying stories. And in the book, I actually have his account. So it's not my retelling, but he tells what happens. And of course, there's far more details and it's far more terrifying. But that is one of the stories that haunts me to this day, and we don't know what it is. And every once in a while when I visit there, I ask him about it, but it's almost like he wants to keep it on the down low. It's not that he won't talk to me about it, but he's tried not to think about it, and he doesn't like to talk about it around his wife too much. And, it's just one of those things. It's a great mystery. We don't know what made a noise like that. And you know what? It may be best that we don't know what made a noise like that.
Yeah. Boy, that would be my one and only visit there, I think.
By candlelight, because there's no electricity.
That's right.
in the castle, so it's like, okay.
Creepy. Anyway. All right.
Is there a deadbolt?
Yeah, give us one more before we have to wrap up for the night. Give me one more good creeper.
Okay, so one of my favorite little sort of creepy stories takes place in a town not far from where people may know this about me, but I grew up in California, and I recently, as in 2 years ago, relocated to a small town in the greater Twin Cities area. And there is a very gruesome story that I stumbled upon on a plaque as I was walking along by the lake one day. So I'm walking my dog by the lake, and I see this plaque, and I'm a nerd, so I'll read like historical plaques, and I don't care, what people think of me. So I stop and I read this plaque, and I'm expecting it to say, here was once the shoreline of this great lake, and this happened, or, a great man once lived here, and that's his house behind you. And that's not the story at all. The story is that on that corner, right behind where I was standing, there was a terrible carriage accident in which some horses got spooked and the carriage was upturned. Well, the backstory to it is that at one point, before the town was formed, it was sort of a resort town where people would go in summer. They would summer on the lake. They would come up from the Twin Cities or other cities in Minnesota, and they would come up to this region and, be on this big lake. And there was like this lovely kind of resort, slides and all kinds of crazy things. So this kind of Victorian era, grandiose, summer resort. And at the shoreline of the lake, there were burial mounds. The local natives had probably about 18 mounds that were their remains were in there. So because it's the horrifying era of complete demolishing of ethnic culture, someone erects a gazebo on top of it and takes photos and sort of makes this, sacred site, this kind of like, hilarious, lovely kind of anomaly that you can snap a photo with. Well, the city finds that the gazebo isn't safe and there's a little bit of an accident or something like that. And so they make them take the gazebo down. But people are still sort of milling about and poking about in these burial mounds. And then there's this terrible carriage accident in which several passengers are in a coach and four, and they're going around the corner, and the horses get spooked and they upset the carriage, and several people are killed. So the city declares that, the mounds are all going to be flattened. Whatever remains are in there, whatever's found in there will be extracted by archaeologists, and they will be sent to the Science Museum in St. Paul. And so this is what happens. They demolish the mounds. They take all the bones and all the artifacts out, and they ship them in boxes and train cars down to the museum in St. Paul, which at the time probably took a good, 2-hour journey or something like that. So they get it down there. The Science Museum opens up the train car and says, well, we'll take all the artifacts, but we cannot take human remains. We're not taking those bones. So the remains stay at the museum, and then they ship back the bones of 18 bodies up back up in the train car, these skeletal remains. So now we have this kind of, carload of just anonymous remains. I mean, nobody knows exactly who they are because, of course, all of the kin have long since been purged from the area.
They're probably Vikings fans waiting for a Super Bowl win.
Okay. So the people of the town decide to repatriate the 3 of the bodies back into the area next to the lake, which is quite forward thinking of them. I mean, quite progressive of them considering the times. They repatriate 3 bodies, but they never say where they put them. They just say they go back into where these burial mounds were originally. And then the remaining bones are buried in a sort of like a group grave in the local cemetery where there is a plaque today. So that's not necessarily, that's terrifying for many other reasons, but it's also a very sort of gruesome and haunting story that, you never know what you're going to find when you're out walking the dog. Stop and read those plaques that you've ignored all your life.
No. Now I know there's horrible things on them. I don't want to learn that stuff, Varla. I just want to believe that the world is a nice little happy place. And I already don't like going outdoors. Now I got to worry about the fact that I might be stumbling on dead body parts.
That's right. Well, and one of my goals is to eventually get up the courage to knock on the door of the homes in that area and interview the residents and ask them if they have ever had any paranormal experiences.
I'll go with you.
Are they aware of the history? Oh, let's do it together.
And if any of our listeners are from that area, you can email me, dave@darknessradio.com, if you've had any weird experiences. And Varla will have her back on the show, and we'll talk about this on a Parashare and update it. But if you
and I've just left you Easter eggs of where it is because I'm not going to reveal my home address.
Right.
But if you are familiar with the area, you can figure it out, I think.
Very cool. Well, let me know. I'll go out. I'll take an afternoon and go with you, and we'll go knocking doors on a Saturday.
Yeah. That'd be so fun.
Yeah, let's do it. I'd love to get out there, and maybe we'll film it and put some of the videos up on Fache Book. We'll do like a live video stream and see if we can get some stories from that area.
Just stop. We'll just stop people at random. We'll bring my dog because people love my dog, so they'll want to talk to my dog, and then we'll hook them.
I love it. I'll borrow a baby if I have to. We'll use puppies and babies to get our feet in the door.
We'll do anything.
Varla Ventura's Paranormal Parlor, Ghosts, Seances, and Tales of True Hauntings. The book comes out officially on June 1st, but you can go pre-order it right now by visiting darknessradio.com and clicking on the Killer Deals link. And remember, while you're there, subscribe for the best in true crime talk radio. Check out our True Crime Tuesday banner. We're now over 1,600 members. We'd like to continue to climb. Get us up to 2,000. You want more Darkness Radio? We're putting up some of the throwback episodes on Tuesdays and Thursdays from time to time. But if you want brand new content, stop waiting. Jump on board and hear some of the best in true crime talk radio. Plus, you get Dumb Crime, Stupid Criminals, I Knew a Killer, and more. It's all available for you, and it's only $5 a month. Come on, $5 a month. If you dig around in your kid's room, you'll probably find some money under their weed stash and porn mags, and you could just use that. It's about time we steal from our children so that we can enjoy True Crime Tuesday. It just seems like the karmic thing to do. So sign up now, and remember, you can do it month by month, and once you subscribe, that gives you all the episodes for that month, plus all of the past archives. But once you get started, you're going to love it and stick with us, so try it. Check it out right now. Go to darknessradio.com, click on the True Crime Tuesday banner, and subscribe. Never miss another minute of the best in True Crime Talk Radio. For Tim Dennis, I'm Dave Schrader. I hope you have had a wonderful week, and we will see you again here on Monday with more supernatural news and Parashare on the best in Paranormal Talk Radio. This has been another edition of Beyond the Darkness.